Touch ID is back, ladies and gentlemen, and it's not on the home button. It's on the iPad Air 4. Yes, I know, we've talked about that iPad before, but I want to entertain the idea considering the fact that there's never been a specific type of biometric that Apple has only used once, okay? Whether they put Touch ID in the home button, they brought it to the iPads, they brought it to the entire iPhone lineup. That became a standard. It was not a one-time, one-off biometric. Same with Touch ID in the power button on the MacBook Pro. Originally, it was just a pro-grade biometric, but then it made its way into the MacBook Air. And same with Face ID. It started with the iPhone 10, but then found its way into iPads, and there's rumors that it's gonna find its way onto the Mac, and of course it's on cheaper iPhones, more expensive iPhones. So why then would Apple go ahead and design Touch ID to be in the power button of the Air 4 and never use that technology again? Probably not likely, right? So in today's video, we're talking about what other devices could end up getting Touch ID via the power button. Let's begin. So knowing that Apple is comfortable making a design like the iPad without a home button and it's all gesture control, but at the same time they don't want to go forward with Face ID, likely for affordability reasons. Given the iPad Air is cheaper, I imagine that leaving out those Face ID sensors allow them to cut costs in a few ways, and apparently even though they had to spend that R&D on developing the Touch ID power button, producing that at scale is likely cheaper than that of producing Face ID at scale. But power buttons or side buttons as a whole are fairly common across Apple's lineup, so if they're comfortable doing it on the iPad, perhaps if Apple gets continuously more bored with the Apple Watch, they could start embedding it into the side button. I think Digital Crown might be a little bit too small and too packed full of EKG equipment already, but bringing it to the Series 7 or Series 8, because let's be honest, they're kind of running out of things to add in the first place, would make the Apple Watch quite the little pack of health features. I mean, biometrics don't help with that, but the fact that it could measure your blood oxygen levels, your heart rate, take an ECG, and at the same time read your fingerprint, all with a device this tiny, could bypass that very, very small process of typing your passcode. I agree. I have spoken in the past on why I don't think the Apple Watch needs a biometric. You're not unlocking it hundreds of times a day like you are with your phone. I agree, it wouldn't make a huge difference because when you activate Apple Pay and your watch is unlocked, it pretty much just works fairly easily anyway. You don't need an additional biometric unless some of you want like two-factor authentication on the watch, so you log in with the passcode once, or you just rest your fingerprint on the side and maybe skip that step. Wouldn't be hugely practical, and I couldn't say that would be a great reason to upgrade your Apple Watch, but Apple's running out of things to add to the watch itself, so that could be something we see in the future. And let's talk about what more of you are interested in. When can Touch ID make its way back into the iPhone? Well, originally there was a report last January that didn't really make much sense to me, but now, seeing how Apple has added Touch ID to the iPad through the power button, I'm starting to wonder if this leak makes a little bit more sense, and it comes from Ming-Chi Kuo, who has a pretty reliable track record, and he said that in 2021, Apple was anticipating on launching a budget iPhone with an LCD display, but it would not be rocking a home button. It would still be a liquid retina, edge-to-edge screen, but not be rocking Face ID and instead embed Touch ID into the power button, which would of course improve on affordability and maybe make it a more entry-level iPhone that can replace the iPhone SE one day, and they named it on the website the SE2 Plus, which doesn't really make much sense to me, and I'm not saying I 100% believe this leak, but knowing that Apple might have iPhones in the works, or at least prototypes of iPhones with Touch ID in the side button, would clear up a lot of confusion on why Apple would develop Touch ID just for the iPad Air 4 and nothing else. So imagining that, the iPad Air has the squared off edge design and we're moving towards that more squared off edge design with the iPhone 12, could that mean that perhaps what Kuo was reporting on wasn't necessarily a mainstream product, maybe it was just a prototype, that Apple wants to see if they can bring back Touch ID to the iPhone in the form of the power button on the side? Some of you may cringe at that idea, and I totally get it, because you're like, hey, Androids have fingerprint readers in the display, just put it in the screen. But the truth is, I don't think Face ID is going anywhere. I don't think they're planning on ditching Face ID for iPhones, but having a backup, having a two-factor biometric essentially that means use Face ID for most things, how However, if you're in that situation where, you know, you're wearing a mask, or perhaps some of you don't like the process of Face ID having to unlock and register that it's you and then jumping to the home screen, that the Touch ID on the power button might be able to help with a little bit. Because in case you didn't see how the iPad Air 4 works, you're able to have a setting where the iPad will jump to the home screen as soon as you rest your finger on the power button, so it isn't as complicated as having to rest your finger, then it unlocks, and then you have to swipe up to go home. Apple actually thought of that, and that's one of the reasons that a lot of people still prefer Touch ID on their older iPhones, because they're able to register their fingerprint, press really quick, and jump to their home screen, whereas Face ID requires people to swipe up. So perhaps if Apple is comfortable with you jumping to the home screen with Touch ID on the iPad, perhaps they'll be okay with you jumping to the home screen with Touch ID on the iPhone, so you can just kind of tap the display to check your lock screen, but if you want to jump straight to the home screen, you can just rest your finger on the side of the phone, which should be very easy and comfortable, given that's where a lot of people put their fingers anyway, and you'll be able to unlock the device relatively quickly. And then you have people who prefer Touch ID for certain reasons, and then people who prefer Face ID and Memojis, the best feature since the slow feed. They can use that too, given iPhones are going to have a big year this year, but in my opinion, next year's iPhone is going to be really, really stale, very, very minor updates, and not a lot of things to talk about. So if they're looking for things to add to get people excited, Touch ID might be able to help with that. Even if it's not underneath the display, having it in the side button, like it is on the iPad Air 4, could allow for more flexibility when unlocking iPhones in the future. And who knows, maybe Quo is right here, and Apple is planning on making a low-end budget iPhone that doesn't have Face ID, but does have Touch ID in the form of a side button, so that you can still have gestures and that futuristic iPhone look while not breaking the bank. Though the confusing thing about that leak is, I don't know how Apple would handle the notch, right? Like, would they have a smaller notch on that iPhone because it doesn't have Face ID sensors? And if so, does that mean that the cheaper iPhone would get a slimmer notch than the iPhone 12s? I don't know, they might get a little too much hype with that. So maybe Apple will keep the notch the same size on that older iPhone, even though it doesn't have Face ID, just so that it looks consistent with the rest of the lineup for some reason. I don't know. Sounds too weird, which is why I wonder if it's a prototype device, not necessarily something meant for mass production. And I don't think releasing brand new iPhones in March, not just a new color, but like the iPhone SE we got this year, I don't know if Apple wants to make that a regular thing. I think SE stands for Special Edition, and if they started releasing SE phones every single year, wouldn't be very special now, would it? They would have to come up with some new marketing term, or I don't know. I don't completely believe the leak, but now I'm starting to think, Apple might actually start adding Touch ID back to more devices without the home button. If they're willing to do it with the Air 4, I don't see why they can't bring it to more devices, and I've seen plenty of people suggest that they want Touch ID on the watch, even though I think that would be kind of stupid. It would save you those couple of seconds in the morning of having to type in your passcode or make things extra secure, and the Apple Watch is running out of things to do anyway, so they might as well add it. And bringing it back to the iPhone for those who want it could incentivize people to update who aren't a big fan of Face ID, though I'm curious what you guys think. What other devices or what other applications could Apple bring back Touch ID with, specifically using the power button method that we're seeing on the Air 4? Feel free to let me know. This is your Apple Shape here, and I'll see you in the next one.